I'm going to talk about the role of philanthropy in general, what we've learned about sort of what foundations can do that's useful, and maybe some things that we do that isn't. And then Patricia's going to talk about, specifically in violence prevention, what we think we could do better and perhaps are doing well and maybe not doing so well to begin with. So in the survey and in the conversations we had, the first thing that we identified about foundations in the ideal world, we don't necessarily practice this all the time, is that we are able to take risks. We sometimes do, and I would say always should, have a healthy appetite for risk because we have fewer consequences when we fail than almost anybody else, especially when we're an endowed foundation. So we don't deal with political consequences. I deal with my board, for example. That's about as far as the consequences can go from my own perspective, and of course in the countries with our partners, the risks associated with the people that we work with. But we don't have the same kinds of situations that some of our colleagues have where they have to think very deeply about who to copy on each email and how to handle the political risks of daily life. Two kinds of risks that we talked about and identified. One was about financial risk, the potential to lose or waste money. And the second was political risk, which is my favorite one to talk about, so I may spend a little bit more time there. Financial risk. Does anybody know who this person is? The woman in the middle is Joan Ganz Cooney. She was a marketing executive in New York in the 50s, 40s, 50s, 60s. And the reason that she's important is because the reason Sesame Street exists is because she was sitting in a room in 1966 with somebody from the Carnegie Corporation called Lloyd Morissette. And they had a conversation, and they agreed on a common goal, which was to produce a children's television show. I need to read this because it's a good quote. That would master the addictive qualities of television and do something good with them. So they're sitting in this office, and 14 years prior, the Ford Foundation had made a grant to create what would become the public broadcasting services in the United States, which was impossible for anybody but a foundation to invest in because there was no chance it was ever going to make any money. And so the private companies didn't want to spend money on it, and public resources were difficult to justify. So they did a couple years of research, and then with the Ford Foundation and the U.S. federal government, who felt a little more comfortable coming in because there was some private capital involved, set up Sesame Street. And 2009, Sesame Street's in 120 countries, and there are 20 international versions. It wouldn't have happened had Ford and Carnegie not been willing to take a financial risk at that moment. Another one, which is just happening, and I'm not going to go into detail, but we could in the conversations, is something that UBS Optimus Foundation and the Children's Investment Fund Foundation is doing. And they are they DIBs or SIBs? Development impact bonds for girls' education in India. So it's a situation where a private entity puts up the capital so that the government doesn't have to. And if the program meets certain results, a guarantor will then pay for that. So it's based on performance, but they remove all of the risk from the government officials, and they only have to pay if it works out. And it's just, I don't know if it's even started, but it's starting. But it's a second example of sort of a place where a private foundation can reduce the financial risk to a public entity so that they're willing to get involved in something that they otherwise wouldn't. Second is political risk. And frankly, I think that foundations could do this very well and do not do it very well. And by political risk, I mean supporting unpopular views, questioning orthodoxy. And the reason I put this picture up here, Peter Bell, who passed away recently, he and a group of people, and very few people know this story, at the Ford Foundation in the 60s, 70s. It was him, Jim Hines, William Carmichael, Abe Lowenfeld, and who am I missing? So this was a time when the Ford Foundation said, we don't get involved in politics. We're just about economic development. We're not interested in that. Yeah? Okay. And so what they did is, these were during the military dictatorships in many Latin American countries, and they started creating scholarships and putting together think tanks, essentially to save the lives of intellectuals who were threatened by the military regimes. And at the time, if you had asked them for measurable benchmarks, there's nothing that they could have given you. Peter's standing next to Ricardo Lagos, who eventually became president of Chile. He was one of the people that was saved by this risk. Fernando Cardoso, who was a president of Brazil, was also saved by this process, sent a representative to Peter's funeral. And there are big risks that they took and played out over a very long period of time. And it doesn't happen as frequently as we would like. I won't go into detail into this one, but it's a great example. Man's name is Joaquin. He is from India. He grew up in a slum in the 1970s, and he essentially started a slum dwellers movement to gain housing rights. And this led to funding from the Ford Foundation when nobody wanted to fund this because it was politically very difficult in India. They were recently nominated for the Nobel Prize, him and Shack Dwellers International, and they have affiliates in, I think, about 33 countries. Again, a situation where they were willing to take a big risk. The second area, and I'll run through this quickly, was about the kind of capital we have. So I have a budget at my foundation of $25 million. I'm not sure what yours is. They have a budget of $3 billion. Government. I mean, it's dwarfed by these institutions. $4.5 billion. So what we need to think about as foundations is what can we use our money for that other people can't. So one idea is patient capital. The Ford example is a good one. You can wait for results for a very long time. Connected capital, if you look at the people on our boards and things of that nature. Huh?
Can you just try to keep the time?
Didn't we say 20 minutes?
Was it?
10 and 10?
Because you're two into one together, aren't
Yeah.
you?
Okay.
Or are you giving the whole...
No, I'm not giving the whole thing. Okay. What time are we at?
We're 10 minutes now. So.
Okay. Can I take 5 extra minutes?
Sure.
Thank you. And then quick capital. We can respond very quickly to things when other people have to go through a bureaucratic process. So I'll share one example, which is us. This is Oscar Van Leer in the 1970s. In 1971, they met with the Kenyan government right after Kenya was becoming independent or had just become independent. First goal was universal primary education. Not him, but our director at that time met with people in the ministry, said, what about preschool? And so over 40 years, we spent about 30 million euros to build the infrastructure for the training of preschool teachers in the country. It eventually trained the majority of preschool teachers in the country. Until recently, it had by far the highest enrollment in preschools in the region. And it led to the first World Bank loan for early childhood education in Africa, which was in the 90s. So the message is if we're able to wait, we can use our money very effectively. We don't obviously always do that. Second, this is Mohammed Yunus, started with the Ford Foundation grant in 1976 in Bangladesh. You know the history of microcredit. Connected capital, the reason we have the Common Core standards in the United States, which is a way of measuring educational outcomes, whether you agree or disagree with this, it's because he has a lot of clout and a lot of resources, and he used both of them. And if you look at the boards of foundations, they because of our nature, they have very powerful people associated with them. So connected capital and using those connections to make the money go further is the second. And then the last one, and I'll finish, is quick capital. This is from the Affordable Care Act. I won't say who the foundations were, but during the campaigns around this, there were quite a few foundations who were reacting very quickly with a lot of the ads that were going on, both the positive and negative ads, and they were able to react to developments on the ground and to be part of a political process that if you have to go through a large bureaucracy, there's virtually no way for you to use the capital. So we can take risk, and we can use the kind of capital we have creatively, and Patricia's going to talk about how that might work in violence against children specifically.
See? Okay. Okay, so we, as Michael said, we asked for input from a number of experts from academia, program implementation, and philanthropy to help us kind of summarize what the role of philanthropy specifically has been and is and could be in preventing violence against children. So one of the conclusions was, and it's a little bit of a conflict of interest if I say that, but that's honestly from the survey, was that philanthropy has played a significant role in what can be seen growing momentum in preventing violence against children. And so I just want to give two examples that can be seen as successful. Now I need to. With them though. Whoop. Whoop. Okay. Well, I don't even know if I need those slides. So.
Go right.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. Good. Yes. Thank you. So, a lot of you probably know the Girls Not Brides movement of these 400 civil societies and 60 countries that have come together to end child marriage. And somehow this group was able to package and frame an important issue in a way that captured people's attention, so that they were able to gain momentum. It was funded by a whole coalition of philanthropic donors. Another group of philanthropic donors has had great success in Brazil, where this year a law was passed on ending corporal punishment on children. So these two examples show a couple of the roles that philanthropy has successfully taken in preventing violence against children. So it's on one hand, raise awareness or push critical issues onto a political agenda, then act as a convener, either convene public and private sector or different disciplines. Another issue that come up that philanthropy has contributed in doing is show the magnitude of the problem, as illustrated by the Together for Girls initiative, UNICEF and CDC, or the Optimus studies that we have funded. And by illustrating the magnitude of the problem, it has kind of shown the urgency for moving ahead with identifying solutions that work to address the problem. And this is where the Global Evaluation Challenge Fund that was mentioned before has also set in, where many of you know its mission is to evaluate what works in low and middle income countries, to raise awareness of the importance of doing so, and the strength and capacity to do evaluations. So this is an initiative that's ongoing to try to produce information on what works in low and middle income countries to prevent violence against children. So now I can press the button. So despite some of these successes, it was very clear that the sense was that there hasn't been yet a significant dent made, and as we all know, so much remains to be done. And some of the key challenges that were emphasized by the experts was the need to further build the evidence, particularly also because there was a great concern raised that many funds still pour into efforts with uncertain outcomes, and which has a big risk of wasting resources and either into ineffective or harmful programs. Then that there is a lack of knowledge about effectiveness of programs in specific contexts or environments. And then last, that has been talked about a lot during the conference also, is this fragmentation of the field and the need to unify. So let me try to pull together the information, look at what are the key challenges and key opportunities if we look at wanting to achieve a kind of a reduction of violence against children on a population level. And definitely, to have this concerted effort of philanthropy will be necessary. So one thing that has come up is the need to find effective mechanisms to communicate, on one hand, the need to invest in violence prevention, and then also the optimal manner of doing so. So we then try to, according to the role that we identified that Michael presented, try to pull out which ones we thought were key for violence prevention. So again, we divided them up into appetite for risk and the access to versatile capital. So in terms of the risk, the political risk that Michael talked about, so violence against children is a sensitive issue in itself. Actually, that is why that is actually important. Not very many politicians probably feel comfortable talking about that. Or we've talked a lot about the need to change norms that can be politically tricky. And the other risk that we talked about is the financial risk, or to invest in testing new ideas, innovations that we don't know whether they will work. And when we thought about, so how is this relevant, particularly for violence against children, since this is an emerging field with emerging capacity, managing that risk of the philanthropic community investing in these new ideas and testing them so that they can be served as scalable solutions to governments is. So how we thought of the importance of managing risk is, on one hand, capacity strengthening and due diligence of organizations. We actually heard in the survey quite a few examples of funds being dispersed to organizations where then the organization couldn't actually handle the grant. So that's a huge risk of investment. Then in terms of the versatile capital, an obvious capital that philanthropy has is money, the most obvious one. But the progress that we can make over the next 30 years will really depend on how much money will be available. And for that, it's still a very select small group of funders that invests in violence against children. We'll need to pull other funders in and convince them of the importance of the cause. And I know that the now called Elevate Children, the International Child Protection Funders Group, is something that they have taken on to try and bring other funders in. Then the patient capital that Michael talked about also seems particularly important for the issue. If we think about wanting to break intergenerational cycle of violence, it will take time to see if programs work. It will also take time to change norms, and to have a consistent and reliable funding source will be important to follow through. Then the connected capital, the access to innovative partnerships, to break down the silos that is still very prevalent in the violence field. But there are some, you've probably heard of some of the movements, the integration of violence prevention and early child development, the efforts to integrate violence against children and violence against women, or this very conference was really kind of come together with the Optimus Foundation having this idea together with you, working on this and making this conference happen. So I'm really happy. This is a great opportunity to present these preliminary ideas, and we'd be really happy to get feedback, and maybe you have other ideas of how philanthropy can contribute to reaching the goal that Manuel set for the conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much.